One of the things that I think we can often wrestle with in our culture is how can we actually know that there is a God? The culture that we exist in the West is secular, which means the concept of God has been moved out by and large from the public square, and it's essentially something that's been moved into the private space. Your belief as God is something that is private. It's not really to be discussed publicly. It's not held in any sense of value more and more within our Western culture. What's interesting in response to that is there's actually been a rise in our culture in spiritual curiosity and spiritual practices, but not then a lot of reasoning when it comes to the issues of faith. And I think it can leave many of us in a place where we wonder, is there evidence for God? Is it merely faith? Is there reason behind it? I remember wrestling with this when I was in my younger days, when I first went to a secular liberal arts college. And there was a lot of challenges to the idea of God. And it was almost seen that if you believed in God, you were less than intellectually when it came to issues of reason or science or whatever. And I think that kind of leads us to the question of, well, how do I know then? Is there evidence for God? Is it simply blind faith? And so I want to talk a little bit about how we actually can know that there is a God. And I think first, the starting point that we need to begin with is the recognition that every single person operates from a set of beliefs. Every person believes something. There is no universal evidence that convinces us that this is, in fact, the reality and involves no aspect of interpreting that evidence and then coming and formulating beliefs. This is what we classically understand as a worldview, right? It's how we make sense of what we see in our world and then try to put that together in a comprehensive way. And so the question, though, then is, what are actually those beliefs? That should be the question. It's not a question of faith versus non-faith. The question is, what are actually the reasons for why we believe what we believe? And when it comes to the question of how do I know that there is a God, the underlying belief, I think, that must be explored is, if there is in fact a God, then he should reveal himself to me. And that is kind of the main idea that I think a lot of people feel. Hey, if God's really out there, then show yourself. Let me know. I want to actually know that there is a God. So how can we know? Well, this is where the Christian doctrine and understanding of revelation comes in. Because what Christians understand and what we believe is that God has revealed himself. And because he has revealed himself, there are actually legitimate reasons for believing why God exists. Christians historically would point to 4 ways in which God reveals himself that helps us to understand how we can know that he exists. First is that God has revealed himself in creation. Psalm 19:1. I'm going to pause because I realized I forgot to mark my text. And so I'm going to be like taking forever to flip through my Bible because I have multiple references here. So just give me a second. I'm going to mark them with my tab so I can do quick. The first way that he's revealed himself is in creation itself, in the world that we can observe around us. For instance, Psalm 19:1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Paul would make reference in Romans chapter 1 that God ultimately has shown himself in the world so that people are without excuse. He says in 1:19, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. We've long held that when we observe creation, when we observe the world around us, it points to God. It points to God as creator, and it points, as Paul said, to his eternal power and divine nature. Christians have looked and seen and made arguments such as the reality that if we observe our world, one of the things that we note is that our world operates through the reality of cause and effect. But at some point, there must have been an uncaused cause that would actually initiate all the cause and effect reality of our world. So who is that uncaused cause? Well, the reality of cause and effect in our world points that there is a creator. There's someone beyond creation that actually was the initiator of that reality. When we look at the intricate design of our world, the way things work together, the complexity, the fine-tuning and balance of the universe, it points towards design. What's interesting is even today, there's emerging theories that have looked at the world and what's emerging, and they've started to claim that we live in a simulation, that we actually live in a world that's almost like the Matrix. Like it's just a simulation that was created by someone else. Now, as Christians, we wouldn't hold to that necessarily, but I think what's interesting is that even within our secular philosophy, there's starting to be the emergence and recognition. There's such a level of design that it seems like somebody made all this, just like you would design a video game, right? And at some point as Christians, we step back and say, yeah, that's what we believe. If you look at creation, it points to a designer. It points to someone outside of our reality that has actually initiated and created it. And that there's actual evidence that points to why you could believe that that is God. The second thing we would say is that God has revealed himself in our hearts. Ecclesiastes 3 reminds us that God has set eternity in the human heart. So not only when we look outward do we think there's good evidence for God, but even when we look inward, that the human heart in reality has a sense of transcendence, that we have a feeling and reality to recognize beauty, to recognize things that are just beyond the physical world and the physical realm. Even the fact that we have an increase in spiritual curiosity recognizes many people are noticing there's something about us that's more than physical. There's some sense within our hearts that moves beyond just the material world, that sense of transcendence. Another reality that we see in our hearts is the aspect of morality. Romans 2:14 says that those who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires. They are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. All Paul's trying to say there is, listen, by the way we act, by our sense of right and wrong, we recognize that there's something written on our hearts, what we would call the moral law. Well, where does the moral law come from without a moral law giver, without somebody who establishes right and wrong, who determines what's good and not good within our world? But there's some sense we have within our hearts of that morality. Even beyond that, we recognize and all of us desire for a purpose, for something beyond ourselves, bigger than ourselves to be connected to, that align our purpose of humanity, that we're more than just chemicals and cells and material, that longs in our heart. I think C.S. Lewis made this argument best when he made the simple statement that atheism turns out to be too simple, he said. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. I think that's one of the things that I have always struggled with the reality of atheism and even agnosticism. Why do we have a sense that there's some greater meaning if there actually is no meaning? We wouldn't have that longing, that desire for things like justice and beauty and righteousness, for the world to actually be right. We all recognize it's broken, but why do we think it should be a certain way? What is it that about our hearts? Well, that's because we believe God has actually given evidence in our hearts that recognize his existence. Third, Christians would say that God has revealed himself in his word, that his word contains the revelation of God. Paul wrote to his disciple Timothy and said, all scripture is God-breathed, meaning God has actually inspired the recording of his word to give a revelation of himself from the very beginning. That what we have recorded in the scripture is actually a record of God's revelation so that we might come to know him. And that part of the way God reveals himself is through his word. It shows us who he is. It just shows us his nature and his characteristics and how we can come to know him. And then finally and fully, Christians would say that God has revealed himself through his Son, that Jesus is the ultimate evidence for the reality of God's existence, right? This is why the author to Hebrews begins his letter with saying, long ago and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophet. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he's appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And the reality is that when we look to Jesus, we see the revelation of God in his life, in his death, and then ultimately in his resurrection, that his power that overcomes the dead and overcomes death ultimately reveals the reality of who he is as God. And so, as Christians, we would say all of this evidence points to the reality that there is God and that we can know that God exists. If you're curious about that, I would encourage you to start with Jesus. He's always the best starting point to see what is God like and what is he revealing about the truth and reality of God. But take these claims seriously. Wherever you're at, however you might be watching this, what I want to encourage you to do is to take these claims seriously. These are things Christians have claimed for a long time, and they, I think, deserve to be wrestled with, not easily dismissed. Think them through. Take them time. If you make the choice ultimately to reject them, that's your decision. But don't do it because someone else has told you to. Don't do it because culture makes faith seem silly. Instead, do it on your own terms by exploring the claims of Christianity that God does exist and that we can know he exists, and wrestle through it for yourself. That would be my encouragement.
Thanks for watching Everyday Theology. For more content like this, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.